The calm before the storm. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the highway as Governor Marcus Hayes cruised in his sleek black sedan. It was one of those rare afternoons when the road was quiet, and the tension of the day seemed to fade away into the background. Marcus, a tall, charismatic black man in his early 40s, had just wrapped up a town hall meeting in a small suburban town. The event had gone well. His message resonated with the crowd, and he'd spent the better part of the day listening to the people he served, connecting with them on a personal level. Now, as he made his way back to the state capitol, he couldn't help but think about the evening ahead. He was looking forward to spending time with his family, perhaps unwinding with his wife and kids over a quiet dinner. Marcus was dressed impeccably, his dark suit sharp and tailored to perfection, his polished shoes reflecting the soft rays of the afternoon sun. His car, a luxury sedan gifted to him by the state, was parked in the designated governor's parking, its black exterior gleaming like a beacon of authority. As he drove down the road, a sense of calm authority surrounded him. He had earned his place in the world. After all, rising from humble beginnings to become the governor of one of the country's most progressive states. He glanced at his state-issued license plate, which read Governor in bold letters. The plate, a small but powerful symbol of the office he held, made it clear to anyone who saw it that he was no ordinary citizen. Marcus smiled to himself, thinking about how far he had come. As a young man, he had faced countless obstacles, prejudices, challenges, and hurdles put in his path simply because of the color of his skin. But here he was, the product of years of hard work and perseverance, representing the hopes and dreams of the people who had put their trust in him. As he cruised along the highway, Marcus let his mind wander, considering the challenges that lay ahead in the coming weeks. The state budget was looming, and there were still debates over several key pieces of legislation. But for now, the road ahead was clear, and the quiet solitude of the drive offered him a rare moment of peace. He leaned back in his seat, his eyes focused on the horizon. That peace, however, was short-lived. Out of nowhere, the shrill sound of sirens pierced the air, and the flashing red and blue lights of a police cruiser appeared in his rearview mirror. Marcus's brow furrowed slightly in confusion. There was no reason for him to be pulled over. He hadn't been speeding, his tags were up to date, and his car was in perfect condition. He wasn't driving erratically, either. So why, he wondered, was he being stopped? The cruiser grew closer, its lights flashing in rhythm, as the officer behind the wheel positioned himself in a way that would make it impossible for Marcus to continue driving without stopping. Marcus hesitated for a moment. Then, as the officer's sirens blared louder, he slowly signaled to the right and pulled over to the shoulder. His hands rested on the steering wheel. His fingers curled around the wheel as a quiet unease began to grow in his chest. He had been stopped by law enforcement officers countless times over the years, but this felt different. There was something in the way the officer had moved, the aggressiveness with which the sirens had sounded, that made his instincts flare. This wasn't a routine traffic stop. As he brought his car to a stop, Marcus instinctively adjusted his suit jacket and checked his reflection in the rearview mirror. He couldn't afford to let his guard down. He knew the dangers of being a black man stopped by police, even one as powerful as a governor. There were stories, countless stories, of routine stops escalating into something much more dangerous, especially when the person being stopped was a black man. Even though he was the governor, even though he held power and influence, Marcus knew all too well that the assumptions people made based on his skin color had the potential to turn deadly. He took a deep breath and reached for his wallet, his fingers brushing against the smooth leather of his wallet as he prepared to show the officer his identification. As he did, a feeling of unease crept into his mind. There was no logical reason for him to be stopped, but this wasn't just about the law. It was about something deeper, something ugly. Prejudice. He had seen it in boardrooms, in the halls of power, and in the streets. He knew the look, the narrowed eyes, the lingering stares that came when people saw him as less than, because of the color of his skin. The sound of boots on asphalt interrupted his thoughts as the officer approached his vehicle. He couldn't see the officer's face yet, but he noticed the way the officer walked. Purposeful, swaggering. There was an arrogance in the officer's steps, a hostility in his posture that made Marcus tense. This wasn't a cop doing his job. This was a man who relished the power he had over others, a man who was ready to exert that power with the slightest excuse. The officer reached the driver's side window, his hand resting on the holstered gun at his side. Marcus immediately recognized the posture, the subtle threat embedded in the officer's movements. The officer's eyes narrowed as he looked Marcus up and down, scanning his dark skin, his expensive suit, and his well-kept car. License and registration. The officer barked, his voice sharp and commanding. He didn't even bother with a greeting, no pleasantries, no acknowledgement of Marcus's role in society. It was a demand, not a request. Marcus raised an eyebrow. He could feel the tension mounting in his chest, but he kept his expression neutral. "Good afternoon, officer. May I ask what the issue is?" The officer's eyes narrowed further, and for a moment, Marcus thought he could see a flicker of irritation pass over the officer's face. Then the officer responded, his tone growing harsher, more combative. "Don't get smart with me. Step out of the vehicle." Marcus's stomach tightened. He had no reason to step out of the car, no reason at all. He wasn't being arrested, and there had been no explanation for why he was being stopped. He wasn't sure whether the officer was trying to provoke him, or if this was simply a case of racial profiling. But the words that followed made it crystal clear. "Men like you don't belong in cars like that." The words hit Marcus like a slap in the face. His heart raced. But he didn't flinch. He had faced this kind of prejudice before, on the streets, in offices, even in the corridors of power. But this time, it was different. This time, the officer had no idea who he was dealing with. With calm precision, Marcus opened the car door and stepped out, towering over the officer. He was careful not to make any sudden movements, keeping his hands visible at all times. He wanted the officer to know that he wasn't a threat. He wasn't going to give this officer any reason to escalate the situation further. As he stood there, facing the officer, Marcus realized that this was more than just a traffic stop. This was about power. It was about control. The officer didn't recognize him, didn't care who he was. To the officer, Marcus was just another black man in an expensive car, a threat to be controlled. But what the officer didn't know was that Marcus wasn't just any black man. He was Marcus Hayes, the governor of this state. And today, he was going to make sure this officer learned exactly what it meant to judge someone based on their appearance. The confrontation was only just beginning. The showdown. As the sun continued its slow descent beneath the horizon, the highway remained eerily quiet. The fading light bathed the scene in a soft, amber glow, but beneath the surface, the air between Marcus and Officer Reed Hansen crackled with tension. The officer's stance was defensive, almost predatory, as his eyes scanned Marcus, making no attempt to conceal the suspicion and disdain that flickered across his features. Marcus stood tall, his shoulders squared, unyielding in the face of the officer's hostility. He wasn't about to let the officer's assumptions about him define the outcome of this encounter. The officer's words, the venomous accusation that men like Marcus didn't belong in cars like his, still hung heavily in the air. It wasn't a new kind of racism, but the intensity of it in this moment felt like a sharp slap to his face. Marcus had learned to deal with such prejudice from a young age. But in that moment, it felt as though the officer had taken a deep personal dig, not just at him as a man, but at the very foundation of the life he had worked so hard to build. He stood still, his gaze unwavering as the officer continued to scrutinize him with narrowed eyes. Officer Hansen was visibly sizing him up, and Marcus could feel the subtle weight of the officer's contempt pressing down on him. The officer's hand was still resting on the butt of his holstered weapon, his posture a mix of aggression and arrogance. "I'm going to need you to step away from the vehicle," Hansen barked, a slight tremor in his voice now. His earlier bravado seemed to wane as he tried to assert himself. Now, Marcus didn't flinch, nor did he take a step backward. Instead, he stood his ground, his voice steady and firm as he replied, "I'm not sure why you're asking me to step away from my vehicle, officer. Am I being detained?" Hansen's lip curled in irritation, the man's thinly veiled anger slipping through his forced composure. "Don't start playing lawyer with me," he growled, his eyes flashing with disdain. "You think you're above this. You think you can just flash your fancy suit and this car and think you're untouchable." Marcus felt the sting of the officer's words, but he refused to let them show. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate breath, his mind already working, analyzing his options. He had faced prejudice before, but this situation was different. He wasn't just a black man pulled over on the side of the road. He was the governor of the state. And despite the officer's obvious bias, Marcus knew he had the upper hand. "No, officer," Marcus said calmly, but with a quiet edge that hinted at his growing frustration. "I don't think I'm above the law. What I do think, however, is that I'm entitled to understand the reasoning behind this stop. I'm not aware of breaking any traffic laws, and my car and documents are all in order. You still haven't told me why you stopped me." Officer Hansen's eyes flickered briefly to the state-issued license plate on Marcus's car, but the officer didn't seem to make the connection. Instead, Hansen's jaw clenched as his fingers tightened around the gun at his side. The officer took a half-step forward, his chest puffing out, trying to intimidate Marcus. "You're out here driving around in a car like this, suits like that, people like you, thinking you can get away with anything. Bet you didn't even buy it with your own money, huh? Probably a handout, right?" Marcus fought the urge to let his temper flare. He could feel his pulse quicken, his muscles tensing at the blatant accusation. But he also knew this was a test, not just a test of his patience, but a test of his resolve. He wasn't about to let this officer's words provoke him into making a mistake. "No handouts here, officer," Marcus replied, his voice even, though the simmering anger beneath the calm surface was unmistakable. "Just years of hard work and perseverance. I'm sure you've heard of that, haven't you?" Hansen's face contorted into a scowl as he took another step closer, clearly eager to escalate the situation. His eyes locked onto Marcus's with the kind of animosity that made Marcus's stomach churn, but he refused to let it show. "You think you're some big shot now?" Hansen sneered, his breath laced with condescension. "I'm not going to let you talk down to me, you understand. I don't care who you think you are." Marcus resisted the urge to remind the officer of who he actually was. Instead, he chose to play along, keeping his composure while letting Hansen dig his own hole. "Is that so?" Marcus asked, his voice smooth but carrying an undertone of challenge. "Well, Officer Hansen, I think you're mistaken if you think I'm here to disrespect you. I'm simply trying to understand why I've been pulled over." But Hansen wasn't listening anymore. His anger, fueled by his own biases, had taken over. "I told you to get out of the car," the officer barked again, stepping forward in a show of force. "You're just like the rest of them, trying to make something of yourself when you don't belong in this world." The weight of the officer's words hung in the air like a toxic cloud, but Marcus remained unshaken. He could feel the years of racial tension boiling over, a history of systemic inequality manifesting in this one moment. Hansen wasn't just stopping him because of a suspicious vehicle. This was about something much deeper. It was about power. And it was about race. "I'm not stepping out of my vehicle until you explain why I'm being detained," Marcus said, his voice cold, though the fire burning inside him was undeniable. "I don't need to tell you why you're wrong, officer. You've already shown me exactly who you are." The officer stood still for a moment, his eyes narrowing as if trying to figure out his next move. Finally, he grunted in frustration, turning toward his patrol car with the exaggerated swagger of a man who believed he was in control. Marcus didn't move, his gaze steady, his body language conveying a silent strength. As Hansen muttered something under his breath, walking back to his cruiser, Marcus could feel the weight of the moment settling in. He was no longer just a man pulled over by the police. He was someone who had the power to expose the ugliness of the situation, to hold this officer accountable for the prejudice he was displaying. Marcus leaned against the side of his car, his arms crossed as he observed Hansen's movements. The officer had just made the first mistake in what was going to be a series of errors that would ultimately cost him. Marcus knew this. He could feel the shift in the air. Officer Hansen might think he had the upper hand now, but Marcus wasn't going to let it end this way. Not for him, and certainly not for anyone else who had ever faced this kind of prejudice on the side of the road. Minutes passed in silence. The only sound was the hum of traffic in the distance, the occasional car speeding by, indifferent to the drama unfolding on the shoulder of the highway. But Marcus could feel the eyes of the world on him. He knew that any second now, the officer would return with a more elaborate excuse, or worse, escalate the situation further. And when Hansen did return, Marcus was ready. He had already made a decision. He wasn't just going to let this moment slip away. He wasn't going to let this officer's behavior be excused. This wasn't just about him. It was about all the people who had ever been stopped, questioned, humiliated, and even hurt by law enforcement because of their race. It was about time someone stood up, and this time, Marcus was going to be the one to do it. The backup was on its way. The situation was about to change dramatically. But Marcus didn't flinch. He had seen this kind of power struggle before, and now it was his turn to show what real authority looked like. As the officer approached with the air of someone expecting a fight, Marcus was calm, collected, and ready to face whatever came next. The unraveling. The minutes dragged on, stretching out like an eternity. As Marcus leaned against his car, he watched Officer Hansen as he walked back to his cruiser, his hands gripped tightly around the radio, still muttering to himself. Marcus could see the officer's shoulders tense with frustration. The power play that Hansen had intended to execute was starting to slip from his grasp, and Marcus was doing nothing more than standing still, unwavering. He knew the officer was trying to figure out his next move. He could almost hear the wheels turning in Hansen's mind, trying to find a way to regain control of the situation. Marcus knew this moment would not be easily forgotten. Whether the officer knew it or not, he had just crossed a line. Hansen had gone from simply performing his duties as a law enforcement officer to using his position as a weapon. The prejudices, the assumptions, the baseless accusations, these were all too familiar. But the officer had no idea who he was really dealing with. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the trees along the side of the road, and the quiet hum of the highway continued in the background. Still, the tension between Marcus and Officer Hansen was palpable, so thick it could almost be cut with a knife. Marcus' mind raced as he mentally prepared himself for what would come next. He was the governor of this state, and in a moment like this, he realized just how fragile the balance of power was in situations like this. One misstep by the officer, one careless mistake, and this incident could become something much bigger than a simple traffic stop. Marcus couldn't afford to let that happen. The stakes were too high. As the seconds passed, Marcus began to notice subtle details about Officer Hansen. The officer's posture, the rigidity in his shoulders, the tightness in his jaw. Marcus could tell that Hansen wasn't used to being challenged, especially by someone he perceived as an outsider. A black man in an expensive car, a well-tailored suit, standing his ground against authority. That discomfort, that deep unease Hansen was feeling, was the first crack in his shield of bravado. Hansen had made an error in judgment, and Marcus knew that as long as he stayed calm and collected, the officer would eventually have no choice but to back down. But Marcus wasn't going to just let this go. No, this was his opportunity to show not just Hansen, but anyone watching, what it truly meant to wield authority with respect, dignity, and responsibility. He wasn't going to let the officer's narrow-mindedness define this moment. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Hansen returned, holding Marcus's documents in one hand and a look of barely concealed frustration on his face. His steps were slower this time, as if he were trying to summon the confidence to face Marcus again. But the facade of control had begun to crack, and Marcus could see it. The officer's uncertainty was palpable, but he still tried to hold on to his sense of superiority, despite the growing recognition that things were slipping beyond his grasp. "You're a real piece of work, aren't you?" Hansen muttered, his eyes flicking briefly to Marcus before glancing away again. His earlier aggression had been replaced by something that bordered on annoyance, though his posture was still defensive, his fingers grazing the gun holstered at his side. "You really think you're untouchable, don't you?" Marcus remained unmoved. His gaze never left Hansen's face. He had been in the presence of far more dangerous people, people who had wielded power to destroy others, but they had never shaken him like this officer did. There was something different about this moment, something that made it feel even more important than it should have been. "I'm not untouchable, officer," Marcus replied, his voice calm, almost too calm. "But I do believe in accountability. And from what I can see, you're going to need a lesson in that." Hansen's eyes narrowed again, but there was something in Marcus's tone that made him pause. The officer was no longer sure of himself. Marcus could see the subtle shift, the flicker of doubt in Hansen's eyes. He had spent so much of his career exerting his authority over people who had no power to push back. But here was Marcus, a man who stood tall, unbroken, unafraid, and the officer didn't know how to handle it. "I don't need your lectures," Hansen growled, though his voice wavered slightly. "You can't talk to me like that." Marcus took a step forward, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I'm not lecturing you, officer. I'm reminding you of something important. You don't have the right to treat people like criminals based on the color of their skin or how they look. That's not your job. Your job is to serve and protect, not to judge and harass." The air between them seemed to crackle with a new intensity, the weight of Marcus's words hanging heavily in the space between them. Hansen took a deep breath, his eyes darting around, clearly searching for an excuse to deflect. But Marcus could see the officer's confidence starting to erode, piece by piece, until all that was left was uncertainty. Hansen finally grunted in frustration, his voice suddenly harsh as he barked, "I don't have time for this. I'll be right back." He turned on his heel and stomped back to his cruiser, his steps heavy with unspoken anger. Marcus stood still, his mind calculating. He could feel the eyes of passing drivers on him, some of them slowing down as they drove past, curious about the scene unfolding on the side of the road. But he didn't care. The officer had crossed a line, and Marcus was not going to let this injustice go unnoticed. He wasn't going to back down. He glanced at his phone, tapping the screen a few times. He had already made a decision. He wasn't going to let this situation escalate further without ensuring that there was a record of what was happening. If this officer was going to make this personal, he was going to make sure it was documented, and that the world would see it. As Marcus waited, he kept his gaze steady, watching as Officer Hansen disappeared into his cruiser. The seconds ticked by, and Marcus could feel the tension rising again, like a pressure cooker about to explode. Hansen had just made a crucial mistake by trying to intimidate Marcus, and now the officer was in the midst of realizing that his little game of authority was quickly turning into a nightmare of his own making. Marcus could feel it. The shift was coming. The officer would either have to back down completely or escalate the situation even further. Either way, Marcus was ready. He wasn't going to let this go unchallenged. Suddenly, the sound of sirens pierced the air once more, and Marcus knew that the backup had arrived. He could see the two squad cars in the distance, their lights flashing in a blur of red and blue. The approaching officers had no idea what was going on, but Marcus could already hear the faint sound of radio chatter. He could see the confusion in the approaching officers' eyes as they surveyed the scene. This was about to get a lot bigger than just a simple traffic stop. The backup cars pulled up alongside the scene, and two officers, one male, one female, stepped out of their vehicles. The male officer, stocky and middle-aged, eyed Marcus first, then turned to Hansen. The female officer, younger, with sharp eyes, studied Marcus with a calculating glance before directing her attention to Hansen, who was still standing by his cruiser, visibly uncomfortable. The male officer approached, his voice calm but firm. "What's going on here?" Hansen, still struggling to find his composure, cleared his throat. "Just a routine traffic stop. This guy's acting like he's above the law." Marcus's eyes didn't leave Hansen's face as the officer tried to downplay the situation. "What exactly is the problem, officer?" the male officer asked, his gaze shifting to Marcus. Marcus stood tall, his voice steady. "I was stopped without cause. I've complied with every request and provided all necessary documentation. But Officer Hansen has refused to explain why I'm being detained, and he's made several accusations based on nothing but my appearance." The female officer's eyes widened slightly, and she exchanged a look with her partner. Marcus could see the realization beginning to dawn on them. Something wasn't right here. "Suspicious behavior?" the female officer asked, her tone skeptical. "What kind of suspicious behavior?" Hansen faltered, his bravado crumbling as he struggled to find the words. "He's driving a fancy car, and he doesn't look like he belongs in it." The male officer turned to Hansen, his tone sharp. "That's what you pulled him over for." Marcus could see the backup officers beginning to understand. Hansen's mistake was becoming increasingly clear to everyone except him. And as the truth began to unravel, Marcus knew the consequences for this officer's prejudice were about to become much bigger than he could ever imagine. The turning point. The moment of truth was upon them. The backup officers, now fully aware of the absurdity of the situation, stood in a tense silence as they processed the scene. Marcus could feel the change in the atmosphere. What had started as an ordinary traffic stop, a routine moment in his day, had now shifted into a high-stakes confrontation. Officer Hansen's blunder had exposed not just his own prejudices, but a system that allowed such biases to flourish unchecked. The male officer, his features hardening with the weight of what had been revealed, looked at Hansen with a mixture of disbelief and condemnation. "You stopped this man because of his car?" the male officer asked, his voice low but sharp, the disgust in his tone clear. Hansen shifted uncomfortably, his hands now fidgeting with the radio on his belt. He could feel the judgment from his colleagues closing in on him, and his earlier bravado was evaporating. The officer opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy. I thought he was suspicious," Hansen mumbled, but even he could hear how weak his words sounded. Marcus's gaze never wavered from the officer. "Suspicious," he repeated, his voice steady but laced with a simmering anger. "Because I drive a nice car. Because I'm wearing a suit." "You thought I couldn't possibly afford this, didn't you, Officer Hansen?" There was no response. The words hung in the air, impossible to ignore. The female officer, who had been quietly observing the exchange, stepped forward. Her expression had shifted from initial curiosity to one of concern. "Is this true, Officer Hansen?" she asked, her voice now firm, no longer simply neutral. "Did you pull him over because of his appearance?" Hansen's face flushed crimson. His eyes darted to the ground, unable to meet anyone's gaze. I didn't know who he was," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He's driving an expensive car," and his voice trailed off, unable to offer a reasonable explanation. The male officer, still standing tall with his arms crossed, shook his head. "That's no excuse," he said, his voice sharp. "You've been a cop long enough to know better than this. You don't stop someone based on their appearance. You stop someone based on reasonable suspicion, not because they don't look like they belong." Marcus could feel the heat rising in his chest, but he kept his composure. The words the male officer spoke struck a deep chord with him. The truth was so simple, so fundamental, it was frustrating that it had to be spelled out at all. In this moment, it wasn't just about him. It was about the system that allowed people like Officer Hansen to abuse their authority without consequence. How many others had been stopped for the same reasons? How many had suffered in silence, unable to fight back. Hansen's attempts to justify his actions were unraveling before his eyes, and Marcus wasn't about to let it go unnoticed. He had learned long ago that silence in moments like this was often more powerful than words. The longer Hansen hesitated, the more his credibility disintegrated. Marcus knew this was the turning point. This was where the officer's behavior would be exposed for what it truly was: prejudice cloaked in authority. The male officer's eyes narrowed as he turned to Hansen. "You don't get to treat people like this, not on our watch," he said, his tone firm. The officer turned to Marcus, his expression now softer, more apologetic. "Governor Hayes, on behalf of this department, I want to apologize for this situation. This is not how we operate." Marcus gave a brief nod. "I appreciate your apology, but it doesn't change what just happened. What matters now is that we address the larger issue. It's not just about me. It's about everyone who's been stopped for the same reasons. How many others, who don't have the resources or platform to speak up, have been subjected to this kind of treatment?" The female officer, who had been quiet up until now, spoke again. Her voice was no longer as neutral as before, but full of understanding. "You're absolutely right," she said. "This isn't just about one person. This kind of behavior from Officer Hansen needs to be addressed, and it will be." The tension that had been hanging in the air began to shift as Hansen's earlier defiance crumbled under the weight of the other officer's disapproval. The once towering figure of authority was now reduced to a man whose pride had been shattered. The weight of his own prejudice was becoming apparent not only to Marcus, but to the other officers who were now involved in the situation. Marcus wasn't interested in making this personal. He wasn't here to embarrass Hansen, though it was clear that the officer had already done that to himself. No, Marcus was here for something far more important: accountability. The officer had abused his power, and that couldn't be allowed to slide. This was a teachable moment, one that would resonate not just with Hansen, but with every officer in the department who might one day come across someone like Marcus. "I'm sure you're familiar with the idea of probable cause," Marcus said, his voice steady, though it was clear his anger had not subsided. "In this case, there was none. You stopped me based on the color of my skin and the car I was driving. You assumed I didn't belong, and that assumption, based on nothing but your own biases, almost cost you more than you realize." Hansen's face reddened further. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. The officer was struggling to save face, but he had no ground to stand on. He had acted recklessly, and now he was being held accountable for it. The female officer turned to her partner, her gaze sharp. "I think it's time to take this back to the station," she said, her tone decisive. "We'll handle this from here." Hansen remained silent, his eyes darting from one officer to the next. It was clear he was no longer in control of the situation. The officers had made up their minds. They had witnessed his behavior, and they knew it couldn't be ignored. Hansen had made his decision when he decided to treat Marcus as a criminal based on nothing more than a stereotype. Now he would face the consequences. The backup officers exchanged a brief glance, and without another word, the female officer moved toward Marcus, her expression apologetic. "Governor, I'm truly sorry this happened. I can assure you that we'll handle this properly," she said, her voice sincere. Marcus nodded, his face still set in a calm, unreadable expression. "I appreciate that," he said. "But I don't want this to be brushed under the rug. I want to see real change, and that starts with holding people accountable when they abuse their authority. This isn't just about me. It's about ensuring that this kind of injustice never happens again." The male officer gave a firm nod, his face set in determination. "We're going to make sure this is handled appropriately. You have my word, Governor." As the scene unfolded, Marcus could feel a sense of quiet victory, though it wasn't the kind of victory that came with gloating or triumph. It was the kind of victory that came from knowing that the truth had been revealed, and that justice, in some small way, had been done. But Marcus knew that this was just the beginning. The incident would likely become a public story, and the department would be forced to reckon with the broader issue of racial profiling and systemic bias within law enforcement. For now, though, he took a deep breath, knowing that the groundwork for real change had been laid. With a final nod to the officers, Marcus turned and walked back to his car. He wasn't done yet. The battle was far from over. But for today, he had stood his ground. And he had made sure that Officer Hansen knew the cost of underestimating the power of dignity and resolve. The reckoning. The sun was now fully set, casting long shadows across the highway as the night settled in, the air cool and crisp. The flashing lights of the squad cars flickered in the distance, their harsh glow reflecting off the asphalt. As Marcus Hayes slid into the driver's seat of his car, he felt an unexpected weight lift from his shoulders. The ordeal was not over, not by a long shot. But a significant part of it had been resolved. Officer Hansen, who had been so eager to exert his power over Marcus, was now facing the consequences of his actions. For the first time since the stop, Marcus allowed himself a deep breath, but it was a breath tempered by a lingering sense of duty. As the officers began to sort things out, Marcus remained by his car, carefully observing the unfolding scene. The backup officers, Officer Reynolds, the female officer, and Officer Harris, the male officer, were now taking charge. Hansen, his head hung low in shame, was being escorted back to one of the squad cars. The humiliation was evident on his face, but there was little sympathy from Marcus. This wasn't about him. This was about the bigger picture. Hansen's actions were the product of a system that had long allowed biases to seep into the ranks of law enforcement, unchecked and unchallenged. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a wider pattern. Marcus had experienced the subtle sting of prejudice his entire life, and even as governor, he had seen how deeply embedded those biases were in the fabric of society. But tonight, in this moment, something had shifted. Hansen's actions had revealed the cracks in the system. And those cracks, Marcus knew, were about to be exposed to the public in a way that could no longer be ignored. The silence between Marcus and the officers was thick as they waited for the situation to settle. Marcus took another long, steadying breath. There was no turning back now. He had made his point, but this was only the beginning of what would be a much larger conversation. He had no intention of letting this story be buried. The world would hear about it. The backup officers were now preparing to leave. Reynolds and Harris exchanged a few words, their voices lowered, before Harris approached Marcus. There was a visible shift in the air, no longer the rigid formality of authority, but a sense of respect in the way the officer carried himself. "Governor Hayes," Officer Harris began, his tone respectful but direct. "I want to personally apologize for what happened here today. What Officer Hansen did. It was wrong. It should never have happened. And we will make sure it doesn't happen again." Marcus looked at Harris, his eyes searching the officer's face for sincerity. He could see the genuine regret there. Unlike Hansen, Harris didn't try to justify his actions. He understood the gravity of what had transpired. "Thank you, Officer Harris," Marcus replied, his voice steady but firm. "But apologies are only the beginning. I want to know that this is going to be addressed, not just in this case, but across the entire department." Harris nodded. "Absolutely. We'll take the necessary steps to ensure proper conduct. This isn't the kind of behavior we tolerate in this department." Marcus didn't respond immediately. He let the words hang in the air, knowing full well that actions would speak louder than any apology or promise. The officer was sincere, but sincerity alone wouldn't change anything. The problem ran much deeper than one officer's actions. It was about the culture within law enforcement that allowed such behavior to persist without scrutiny. And Marcus wasn't going to let it slide. Turning to Officer Reynolds, who had been silent up until now, Marcus asked, "And what about Officer Hansen? What consequences will he face for this?" Reynolds hesitated, glancing briefly at Hansen, who was now sitting in the back of one of the squad cars, staring out the window, his posture defeated. The officer took a step forward, lowering his voice. There will be an internal investigation, Governor. We'll review the entire situation thoroughly. If there's evidence of misconduct, he'll face the appropriate consequences." Marcus nodded, satisfied with the response. But the suspicion in the back of his mind didn't fully dissipate. He knew that investigations, particularly in cases like this, often became far more complicated than they should be. It was easy for things to get swept under the rug, to let things fall through the cracks. Marcus wasn't going to let that happen. "I'll be following up on this personally," Marcus said, his voice resolute. "This can't be allowed to slip into the shadows. It's not just about Officer Hansen. It's about the system that enables him, the culture that lets this kind of thing happen time and time again. We need to address it head-on, or we're going to continue to see this kind of thing happen." Reynolds nodded, and Marcus could see a flicker of acknowledgement in the officer's eyes. The conversation was no longer about the specifics of the stop. It had evolved into something much larger, something that would impact more than just this one officer. The ripples of this incident would spread throughout the department, and Marcus had every intention of making sure they did. "Thank you for your understanding," Harris said, his voice low. "We'll make sure this is handled correctly. I promise you that." With that, the officers turned to leave, but not before one final exchange of glances. As they drove away, Marcus was left alone by the side of the highway. The lights of their cars receded in the distance, leaving behind only the soft hum of the passing traffic. The world had changed in this small corner of the world, and Marcus knew it wasn't just because of what had happened on that stretch of highway. It was because, for once, someone had stood up and said, "Enough." As Marcus climbed back into his car, he couldn't help but reflect on how far he had come. From the young boy who had struggled against the odds, to the man who now held the highest office in the state, he had faced the harshest challenges life could throw at him. But this moment, this incident, was different. This was about more than just one man's experience. It was about the legacy of inequality that had been built into the very systems that governed the country. He drove on, his mind sharp and focused. The night ahead still had much to offer, but for Marcus, this moment had given him something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Hope that change could happen. Hope that it was possible to challenge the status quo. Hope that when people in power took a stand against injustice, others would follow. But Marcus knew that hope was only the first step. The road ahead was long, and this was just the beginning of the work that needed to be done. This moment on the side of the highway would not be his last confrontation with injustice. But now, more than ever, he was ready for the fight. As he drove on, the weight of the day began to settle back into his bones. But it was a weight he welcomed. It was the weight of responsibility, the weight of leadership, the weight of a man who had stood his ground and made his voice heard when it mattered most. And in that moment, as the city lights of the capital began to twinkle on the horizon, Marcus Hayes knew he was ready for whatever was to come next. The reckoning had only just begun. The long road ahead. The city of Riverside shimmered in the distance as Marcus Hayes drove down the highway toward the capital, his thoughts swirling like the fading remnants of the afternoon light. The quiet hum of the engine was a stark contrast to the charged energy he had just left behind on the side of the road. The confrontation with Officer Hansen had taken a toll on him, but Marcus wasn't ready to allow himself the luxury of relief. This was only the beginning. The incident would soon explode into public awareness, and the ripples of what had transpired would undoubtedly be felt throughout the state, if not the nation. He wasn't sure what the next few days would bring, but one thing was certain. The fight was far from over. As the city lights grew brighter on the horizon, Marcus couldn't help but reflect on the complexity of the situation. Hansen was only one man, one officer, but his actions represented something far greater. A system that perpetuated inequality, an institution that treated people based on assumptions and biases rather than facts or fairness. Marcus had always known that these kinds of injustices existed, but seeing them unfold so openly, seeing the force of authority wielded to target someone like him, was still jarring, even after everything he had seen and done throughout his career. But Marcus wasn't the kind of man who let things fester. He wasn't the kind of man who saw injustice and stayed silent. His career as a lawyer, as a public servant, had taught him the power of speaking up, of taking action when the world felt broken. He had been taught early in life that silence in the face of wrongdoing was a betrayal of everything he believed in. And today, he had done what needed to be done. He had stood tall against the kind of casual racism that so many people like him faced on a daily basis. He had made sure that the officer responsible was held accountable. But Marcus knew that holding one officer accountable wasn't enough to fix the larger problem. That was just the start. The situation was beginning to spiral beyond his control, but he was ready for it. As governor, he knew his position gave him power, but it also placed him under an intense amount of scrutiny. The public would be watching closely, waiting for him to either stand firm or shrink back into the shadows. The media would undoubtedly catch wind of the incident, and once it hit the airwaves, it would spark debates across the state. There were those who would applaud his actions, seeing them as a call for much-needed reform. But there would also be those who would criticize him, accusing him of trying to tear down the very system that had kept law and order intact. That was the nature of leadership. It was a delicate balance, and Marcus knew that the road ahead would be filled with resistance. But this was the life he had chosen. This was the role he had stepped into. And now, more than ever, he was ready to face the consequences of standing up for what was right. The rhythmic tap of the blinker in his car was the only sound for a while as Marcus let his thoughts wander. His mind briefly flickered to his family. His wife, Jutta, and their 2 children were likely at home by now, finishing dinner, laughing together. They had no idea what had transpired on the side of the highway earlier that afternoon. Marcus had already decided that tonight he wouldn't tell them about it. Not yet, anyway. There would be time for that later. For now, he wanted to preserve the peace of his family's evening, knowing that tomorrow would bring the inevitable storm of questions and media attention. As he approached the gates of the governor's mansion, the heavy iron wrought gates slowly parted, welcoming him into the grounds. The mansion, a stately building with columns and large windows, stood like a sentinel against the darkening sky. Marcus could feel the weight of his responsibilities pressing in on him as he parked his car in the driveway. The driveway, once a simple symbol of convenience, now felt more like a crossroads between his personal life and his public duty. He stepped out of the car and walked toward the front door, his thoughts swirling in a constant current. There was so much to do, so much that had to be addressed in the aftermath of the confrontation with Officer Hansen. Marcus had already made up his mind about one thing. He wasn't going to let this incident become another piece of forgotten news. It was time for a change, real change. But change didn't come easily, and Marcus was prepared for the uphill battle ahead. The door swung open, and Jada greeted him with a warm smile, though her eyes narrowed slightly when she saw the tense expression on his face. "How was the meeting?" she asked softly, stepping forward to kiss him on the cheek. "Long day," Marcus replied, his voice quieter than usual. "It's been a strange one." Jada raised an eyebrow, but didn't press him. She could tell something was bothering him. But she knew from experience that Marcus would share when he was ready. "Well, dinner is ready," she said with a smile. "The kids are waiting for you." Marcus managed a small smile in return. "I'll be there in a minute." He needed a moment to himself, time to collect his thoughts before facing his family. He walked to his study, the room lined with books and shelves filled with legal tomes and personal mementos. He sat at the large desk by the window, gazing out at the city below. It was peaceful here, but the quiet felt deceptive. The world outside was anything but calm. As he sat there, reflecting on the day's events, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced down at the screen and saw the familiar name, Jason Turner, his communications director. He swiped to answer. "Marcus." Jason's voice came through the phone, crackling with urgency. "We need to talk. The story's already starting to spread. The press is going to start reaching out soon." Marcus ran a hand through his hair. feeling the weight of the moment. I know. I can feel it. But we can't let this become just another story, Jason. This is bigger than that. I agree, Jason said, his voice steady but clearly concerned. But you need to prepare for the fallout. The media is already starting to spin the narrative. You've got some people supporting you, but others, well, they're not happy about what happened. You've got to be ready for some pushback. Marcus leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for a moment. He could already imagine the headlines, the opinion pieces, the rallies, the protests. He had been through media storms before, but this one felt different. This time, it wasn't just about a piece of legislation or a policy. It was about power, about the fundamental beliefs that govern society. I'm ready, Marcus said, his voice steady now. But we need to take control of this narrative. We can't let them turn this into a smear campaign. The truth has to come out. This isn't just about what happened with Hansen. This is about the systemic racism that infects every corner of law enforcement. Jason was silent for a moment before replying. You're right. I'll start drafting a statement, but you'll need to be at the press conference tomorrow. It'll be better if you speak directly to the public. Marcus knew this moment was coming. He had anticipated it, prepared for it in some way, though he had hoped it would never come to this. Speaking publicly about his personal experience with racism was something he had always tried to avoid. He had always kept a calm, composed public image, one of confidence and authority. But now Marcus understood that silence would be a betrayal. He had to speak up, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been unjustly treated. All right, he said, his voice resolute. Let's get it done. I'll be ready. After ending the call, Marcus sat in his study for a long moment, processing the gravity of the situation. The weight of the fight ahead was heavy, but Marcus was no stranger to challenges. He had faced adversity his entire life, and now he was ready to confront it on a larger scale. It wasn't just about Officer Hansen. It was about changing the system, breaking down the walls of prejudice and injustice that had been built over centuries. The road ahead was uncertain, and the battles would be fierce, but Marcus was no longer just a man in a suit. He was a symbol of change, of the possibility of a better future. As he stood up and walked toward the dinner table, where his family was waiting for him, he felt the weight of the responsibility settle on his shoulders, but he carried it with pride. The journey would be long, but Marcus Hayes was prepared for whatever came next.